Hi, Richard.
Hi, Rabbi. Hi,
Good to
nice to
see you,
see
and
you. How are you?
thank you for joining us again. Thank you very much
Pleasure.
for being accommodating about the time, because I know there was a bit of from last week to this week.
No problem.
So one of the things we've found that as lockdown has come more or less to coming to an end, people are out and about, and so we are actually getting less people to our Zooms now than we were during lockdown, because what was there to do other than listen to Richard Pater and or Netflix? You know, that was a stark choice. But today happens to be a lovely day, and people are out and etc. So we'll just now wait for folks to join us. On the last occasion, you were actually outside.
Yes, yes. I've said throughout the whole year of Zoom, I'm still experimenting. I don't have one set place to sit. It's usually dictated by the kids, but this time of night it's
Right.
relatively quiet. So I'm.
So you're a couple of hours later, aren't you? You're probably what?
Yes.
10 o'clock.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So why don't we just? It's 10 minutes to go. Why don't we just remain on, but take our videos off, and we'll come back in again shortly.
Very good. All right. I'll see you again shortly.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. It is really a great pleasure to invite Richard Pater back again, the director of BICOM. On the last occasion, it was during lockdown, and it was so hugely informative. And Richard was so articulate in being able to unravel some of the knotty issues that were going on, that we thought that at this particular time in Israel, with a number of issues, we'd ask Richard to come back and hopefully to do his magic again in terms of unraveling that which seemingly can't be unraveled by anyone other than him. So, welcome to you, Richard. Thank you so much for joining us. I think where we want to start is, I suspect that most Israelis are completely baffled by what is going on in their country in terms of elections. And if that is the case for people who are in the country, how much more so for us on the outside, the diaspora? We watch this with amazement, the election after election, inability to be able to create stability, etc. Can you just spend a few moments, please, trying to explaining to us where we're up to, where it's going, why we are in this position all over again?
Sure, of course. Rabbi, first of all, thank you very much indeed for having me again. And it's a pleasure to see some familiar faces and to be joining your community again. I mean, broadly speaking, it's the short answer is it's a mess, even from the inside. And I'll try and kind of highlight some of the anomalies perhaps that's going on in the system at the moment. If we start with Prime Minister Netanyahu, because he is really the Marmite issue that either you love him or hate him in this in this latest round of elections, and if the first of the first three elections over the last couple of years were to a large extent a referendum on the Prime Minister's rule, then even to a more pronounced degree, this final one was also very much about the Prime Minister's rule. And as I said, it cuts both ways. In an effort to try and be balanced and impartial, I'll try and frame out just what both sides are saying. In Netanyahu's defense, I would say that he is by far still the most popular candidate to be prime minister. He himself, the Likud party, received significantly more votes than any other party, 30 seats, 25% of the electorate, and only one of two parties that even made it into double figures, just to give an idea of just how proliferated the parliament is. But for Netanyahu's supporters, it's quite clear that he's managed the country for 12 years now. For the last decade or so, since the Arab Spring, or the Islamic Winter, it's sometimes referred to here, he has been able to see Israel through a very steady, turbulent waters in a very difficult region. more recently, obviously, he's brought the vaccines, of which he wanted to claim a huge dividend for doing that. And again, for his supporters would say rightly so. And in the last year, he's also brought 4 peace treaties to the country and brought normalization and a world of opportunities out with the Arab world. So it's a very convincing case for those people who are sure that he is the right man to rule the country. On the other side, they'll see a person that maybe if he started as an effective leader has become convincingly more corrupted, sadly, by various personal issues. He's obviously on trial at the same time. And again, another of these anomalies in the system is that you couldn't be let's say a school headmaster or head teacher and be under indictment at the same time. You can't even serve in the cabinet, in regular cabinet positions under indictment. But there is an anomaly that the prime minister position, you are still able to function. And so we've got the scenario where he's been in court for the last 2 weeks, 3 days a week, and in the evidentiary stage of his corruption trial having started. And other people point to the general mismanagement of it. At the moment, we've got a government which is completely, even the interim temporary government is hamstruck. The security cabinet actually is meeting this evening for the first time in 2 months. But again, there have been cabinet meetings that have been cancelled into an unprecedented level, and we can go on about appointments that haven't been filled, and so there is a high degree of dysfunction going on. In terms of the procedure, just kind of to bring everyone up to date where we are, that just over 2 weeks ago, or just under 2 weeks ago, Netanyahu received formally the mandate from the president. He's got another 2 more weeks in which he is trying to put together a working coalition. But as the numbers on the scores on the doors don't seem to add up for either side, that he has the banking support of the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox parties, and the very hardline right-wing religious Zionist parties, and he's been in I think 4 meetings so far in the last week or so with Naftali Bennett, trying to bring him in and trying to coax him in with all sorts of senior portfolios and other insistence of how senior he will be regarded within the government. But that would only take them to 59. And so the catch is that the Likud have worked for the last year or so on a parliamentary level very closely with the Islamist party, the RAM, United Arab List, not to be confused with the Joint List, which is the collected Arab, the other 3 Arab parties. And there is a chance that they could either join the government or support the government from the outside. However, the religious Zionists, both Smotrich and Ben Gvir, representing the religious Zionists, have refused point blank, and they've repeated it again, doubling down again, that they will be no part of the government, either from inside or outside the support. So if this is the scenario, unless anyone breaks through, and over the weekend, we saw a great deal of pressure being put on Gideon Sa'ar, who formerly left the Likud to join what's euphemistically being called the Bloc for Change. And there's a lot of pressure on him to rejoin the Likud and to join this right-wing government. All sorts of because he's pledged not to sit in a Netanyahu government, there are all sorts of creative thinking out of the box that someone else could start the government formally before handing over to Netanyahu, so Gideon Sa'ar doesn't have to break his promise. All of these scenarios are going to be worked up, and we'll hear other sorts of convoluted plans that we can explore further. But the bottom line is that it seems unlikely at this point, unless someone does go back on one of their promises, that they're able to form a government. And then we're in a scenario where we will have to see whether the other side, what's now being framed as this combination between Lapid working together with Naftali Bennett, who could swing to the other side as well, whether they'll be able to form a coalition. But we can discuss all this as we go forward.
So what is the alternative then to a Likud-led government? Is there any reasonable alternative? Because the putting together the other side is equally difficult and fraught with all kinds of problems.
Well, first of all, there is a procedural issue that the President Rivlin will have to decide. If we presume that the Likud and Netanyahu are not able to form a government and he returns the mandate, the president's got 2 options. He can either assign someone else to form the government, and that's the noises that Yair Lapid has been making. That the idea is that you could have what would comprise of the 2 left-wing parties, Labour and Meretz, 2 centrist parties, Blue and White and Yesh Atid, and 3 centre-right parties, Israel Beitenu, SAR, New Hope, and Yamina, and that collectively would take them to 57 seats. And then again, they would be required what they refer to in Hebrew as gush chosem, or the kind of a blocking minority, that you'd have a minority government, but the Arab parties on the outside would agree to give their backing so that they could survive any of their any votes within the Knesset. So the president can either give it to Lapid if he thinks that he has a realistic chance of that forming, or he can return the mandate immediately straight back to the Knesset, which will make it even harder for someone to form a government, because under those rules they'll have 21 days for any MK to collect 61 signatures in order to present a government. And so the first scenario that I painted, that Lapid could theoretically form a minority government resting on the abstentions of the Arab parties, seems, even though unlikely and hardly a stable government, but one way in which to come out and break the deadlock. The other way would be to hand it back to the Knesset, and all sorts of permutations could then develop. Potentially even another candidate from the Likud could even arise, but these are slightly far-fetched scenarios.
And given the fact that Netanyahu is a past master at these sorts of negotiations and all the arm twisting and enticements, etc., which go with it, having been an close observer of these political machinations for quite a long time, what would be your guess about the most likely outcome?
I think that the Lapid Bennett government, by the way, there's also this whole question mark, which is a legitimate question, because Lapid, the reason why Lapid is being put together, bracketed with Naftali Bennett, is that Naftali Bennett, even though he has only 7 seats, and it's a big constitutional ethical question whether a party with 7 seats could present their candidate to be prime minister. But that question aside, they could be a minority government formed by those 6 or 7 parties that are very ideologically diverse, but all have one thing in common, that they understand that going to a 5th election is even worse than sitting with such ideological diverse partners. And even the Ram party have gone on record today as well, saying that if it was given the choice of supporting a Lapid Bennett government from outside or going to 5th elections, they would also look to support the government to give it some safety net. So, although I'd be cautious to make predictions, it's not impossible that scenario could play out.
And yet the irony over here is that all of these repeated 4 elections are because of in a sense, the elephant in the room, and that is the prime minister. If he were not prime minister, presumably it would not be a difficult task to form a majority government. Absolutely.
As I said in the open, that Netanyahu is the single issue that is so divisive and just divides opinion across the board. There's no doubt that whether it was any other candidate, and again the Likud has a very strong record of sticking with their leaders to incredible loyalty. They've only had 4 leaders in their 40 years around in parliamentary activity, from Begin through to Shamir to Sharon and Bibi. That's it. And if you count Jabotinsky, kind of their ideological father, they've had 5 leaders in a century, basically. So there is very little appetite or precedent for the Likud to change leaders. But if they were to do so, then yes, that would absolutely change the picture.
So you think there's little likelihood that Likud, in the interests of survival, would ditch Netanyahu and say it's time for him to take a walk into the sun?
I don't. That's not a realistic scenario right now. Just interestingly, one of the side issues being negotiated if Naftali Bennett was to go with the Likud is to achieve Naftali Bennett's dream of the last decade, to somehow bring in to have his party incorporated into the Likud, which would help Naftali Bennett position himself the day after as an heir apparent. But now the sequencing is difficult because Naftali Bennett doesn't want to go into that deal before the government is sewn up, and it can be quite clear if he's actually going to form a government before he loses all his leverage by going back into the Likud party.
Why did the electorate not reward Netanyahu for the vaccination program and for the Abraham Accords that he was playing so strongly on?
Well, I would argue that 25% of the vote in 30 seats is still kind of a significant achievement in its own right, and I think it's that the people are not judging him just in a vacuum on these single issues, as impressive as they may be, but taking in a broad spectrum of his overall leadership and his viability to continue as a leader, and that's where a lot of people have question marks.
There is a suggestion in The Economist.
Is there a gluten-free pizza that you can order, Nikki?
Just one time. Let me just mute everyone.
Everyone is gluten-free now.
Okay, so we're back again. So there was a suggestion in The Economist this week that looking at the Netanyahu and the government strategy in relation to this latest episode in Iran, in terms of blowing up the electricity supply for Nantes, that this was amongst all the different kinds of scenarios in relation to the Americans and the sanctions, etc. But one scenario might have been that actually Netanyahu was playing to the home crowd, and in the midst of this moment now, bolstering his possibility of being able to form a government by once again reassuring his electorate that they can strike against Iran and show the strength of Israel and that he is for security, etc. Do you think there's any credence to that?
Well, I've discussed that with the author of that piece, and I have to say I respectfully disagree. That although that is a scenario that kind of makes sense to a degree, and I'm not ruling out that there has not been some cynical use of Israeli security in the past to as you say, kind of to sell it and play to the home team. The general assessment is that these decisions are not made in a vacuum like that. And however all powerful Netanyahu is, these decisions are still based on a strong consensus, certainly with the defense minister, who also happens to be a former chief of staff, as well as the other heads of the security establishment, the IDF, Mossad, and the Shin Bet. And so I think we discussed this also last time around, that despite the dysfunctional nature of politics, I'm still confident that the appropriate mechanism for decision making on those serious security issues remains intact. And I would go further and say that these issues of Iran and kind of the challenge that in Natanz and in other places in terms of the nuclear project, but also with regard to the Iranian, we've now kind of had it highlighted over the naval issues and the ongoing issues we've had for the last 6 years over the entrenchment of Iran inside Syria and the looking to build up the weapons and precision guided missiles. All this is way within the consensus of Israeli politics that you wouldn't find. You could easily put a government together that would back all of these decisions. But that's not really controversial. So it's difficult for Netanyahu to really kind of to gain a click the coupon, as they say here, and kind of gain a genuine dividend when it kind of sits in the very much of a core consensus.
So just before we move on to other topics other than the election, so we've explored the likelihood of a government being formed by Likud on the one side or by the other parties on the other side. In overall terms, what is your guess that the most likely outcome will be a fifth election?
Now, I said if I was betting tonight, which I try not to do, I would say that the Bloc for Change, the Lapid and Bennett camp have a fair chance to form a government. I think the idea of a fifth election is such an aberration for so many people that it would play so badly that there will be a real effort to do anything to avoid that. But I'll just make another comment that in parallel to the process of forming a government, we've also got an incredible situation, actually unprecedented in Israeli political history, where 2 weeks after Knesset has been sworn in, we still don't have a functioning Knesset. And when I say functioning Knesset, the first thing that a Knesset, when it's sworn in, it usually happens on the same day or maximum the day after, in which the arrangements committee is formed, and after that the House committee, and after the House committee you appoint all the other chairmanships and the makeup of all the other committees. And in such a, we were just talking about Iran and Natanz, and the fact that for the last 2 weeks there has been no functioning Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee. It just hasn't convened at all. Is very disturbing for Israeli democracy. And just as much as we need to form a government, there also needs to be that process, which is meant to be coming to a vote tomorrow in the Knesset. Finally, the Likud, again, this is being held up, if we're honest, largely by the Likud party, because they didn't think they had the votes in the arrangements committee, so they basically didn't take a vote because they didn't think they had the numbers, and built in all the machinations over coalition negotiations is also this stalemate within the Knesset.
I see, by the way, some people have their hands up. We'll come to questions shortly. But what are the implications of the absence of a budget for such a long time? Where does that impact in society, in weapons procurement, the military, security, etc.?
It's a problem across the board. I mean, in every single government ministry is working on a scaled budget still from 2 years ago, proportionally for the month. I think, again, we also discussed this last time, that it's affecting the weakest sectors of society, the worst, those that need the budget, obviously in the context of everything within the health pandemic, the budgets for hospitals, for all sorts of medical facilities, for community centres, for schools. That it's how is any manager able to prepare a proper forward planning and budget? And this goes for the same thing now for military spending as well. That there is obviously a great degree to the IDF Chief of Staff, Kochavi, put a great emphasis on his Tnufa momentum plan 2 or 3 years ago that required kind of scaled budgeting for the next 5 years to really take Israel forward to being the most advanced military in the region. And by the way, doing a lot of good cooperation with the UK military on this as well. But all of this is held up because of the lack of the budget, the lack of the functioning, and the other huge issue, if the 4 issues of no government, no functioning Knesset, no budget. And the 4th aspect of it as well are the key appointments. We don't have a justice minister, for example. We have lots of other very senior positions particularly within the justice remit that have just not been appointed because of the stalemate caused in the outgoing government. So it's I'd love to report back a more positive picture, but this is pretty sad.
Yeah, I mean, Richard, you really are painting a very, very dysfunctional picture of Israel. You just wonder how it is able to function at all. You know, the word that comes to mind is that lovely Israeli word which is always used under these circumstances, balagan. But somehow it continues to function. I mean, on a day-to-day basis, people are living, people are doing things, people are being vaccinated. It's extraordinary that you have this sort of, on the one hand, all the trappings of normality, and on the other hand, a great big hole at the very heart, not just of government, but of the democratic process. How do you reconcile the two?
I mean, that's it. I mean, listen. Human nature is resilient and gets on with it, and thankfully, most of the country are not obsessive about the politics. I mean, generally speaking, I mean, as an example, as we mentioned, the Netanyahu trial, it doesn't. I mean, although it features in the media, I don't see some great clamour for the coverage of that or of the government formation. People are over it, that they've understood to be able to get by functioning within people's own lives in spite of the overarching political situation. And a 5th constitutional issue which is coming up, which is the deadline to elect the next president as well, is coming up in the,
Yes, I
in
want
the
to
next
come
couple
to
of
I want to
months.
come to that in a moment. But just before we do that, given all of this, is there no pressure coming from the Israeli population to look at this crazy system of democracy gone mad, in the whole political structure of elections, etc. And is there no appetite from grassroots in Israel for constitutional reform of some form or another? And no doubt, the politicians themselves will resist it with their dying breaths, because nobody wants to lose their power, their etc. But it is a crazy system which is really holding Israel back. And why is there not more of an outcry? Why are people not demanding? Why are the courts not, somebody sort of jumping up and saying, this is what I stand for. We're going to change the system once and for all, and try and introduce stability into our political process?
Well, the only people who are kind of motivated and activated to come out on the street and demonstrate are the whole plethora of anti-Netanyahu organizations, and they range from kind of the quite sensible and moderate, the Movement for Quality Government, through to kind of the Prime Minister organizations. And as I said, there are literally dozens of affiliated organizations, and they get a few thousand people out on the streets every week. But as the election results show, the country is very divided. The Haredim, as the natural partners to Netanyahu, plus the Likud seats, have a narrow minority. There is only a very slim majority, when you look at it, if you kind of split even Naftali Bennett's numbers in half, of people who kind of outrightly voted against Netanyahu. And so the vote is there. The people aren't really kind of that bothered or engaged with issues of electoral reform. It was a kind of a side issue on some of the political platforms. That Gideon Saar, for example, has been talking about term limits for prime ministers, and that seems to have had some traction. And it's not impossible that some legislation in that sense will be put forward. But otherwise, it's not really there. But people understand that you need a functioning. It's a catch-22. You need a functioning Knesset to be able to push through legislation which goes for electoral reform. And whilst it's so divided, it's not even a priority right now.
Yes, turkeys don't vote for Christmas.
Absolutely.
I think we need to find another way of putting that for Israel, but nevertheless. Let's just come back to the corruption trial. What's the update on that, and where do you see that leading to, and how do you think that might impact upon some of these electoral issues?
So I think, for a large part, to answer the last part first, I don't think it's having a major impact on the public, because I think everyone, again, has priced in what they think about this trial, and until there is a smoking gun that proves beyond doubt, and we're not there yet in the trial, then we might see some shifts. But essentially, the trial's been running for 2 weeks. It started off with the evidence given by Ilan Yehoshua, who was the CEO of Walla news agency, which is owned by Bezek. And what the prosecution are building up a case to show in the next few days or the weeks ahead is that now they've proved that the pressure that was put on by the Netanyahu family and by the inner team to affect positive coverage on this news site. The question is there a genuine quid pro quo of any sort of deals for the parent company, for Bezek, and their deregulation, and that Netanyahu made as a trade-off? And so that's going to come within the public light, I would say, within the next 2 or 3 weeks. And there is still there's a long time to go in this trial. I mean, this will go on perhaps for months or even years. So we shouldn't expect a result anytime soon. But I think the fact that the judges have started with case 4000, which deals with the regulation issues over the big telecommunications company and their privatization issues, this seems to be the most weighty, meaty, substantial issue that we will have to understand exactly whether it does meet the full criteria of corruption.
Yes. Okay, so we're going to pause now just to take some questions before we come back to some other areas for discussion. And I saw that Denise Pincherson had her hand up, and Anne Stanton has her hand up as well. You can either wave or put your hand up if you want to ask a question. Let's start with Denise. You need to unmute first, which you can either do by pressing the unmute button, or you can press down. If you're using a keyboard, you can press down on the space bar, and while you press down on the space bar, you'll be unmuted. Denise? Are you able to do this? I know that sometimes you find Zoom quite hard. All right, let's go to Anne. Anne Stanton had her hand up. We'll come back to Denise when she's able to ask a question. Anne?
I do apologize. It went up in error. So
Oh, okay. So you don't have a question?
not at this moment.
Okay. Does anybody else like to comment at this point in time on anything else we've been speaking about? Any of the issues so far? Is that David? David, are you saying that you?
Yes, I'd like to speak. Thank you. Richard, thank you for giving us a good rendition. Just in the interests of full disclosure, I'm actually now an Israeli citizen, to the few of you who know me, but I'm in London at the moment. The question that you asked, Rabbi, I thought the last one was, what could trigger a change in disposition given how dysfunctional the situation is? And as you said yourself, Richard, with everything going on, including the trial, we still haven't seen enough evidence to tilt it. But there is a groundswell of opinion. And I always used to ask taxi drivers what they thought of Netanyahu. And when I first went to Israel, they all loved him. And their response today is rather different. Richard, what can tilt this in the next 6 to 8 weeks of the process that we are undergoing, which could really make people say enough is enough? I recognize that Likud is not in the habit of getting rid of its leader, but if Bibi was to be replaced, we could have a government within a matter of days, because Saar and Bennett and others would come into the fold because they wouldn't be violating their promise. So what can tilt this? And is there anything in the logic of looking at this through the Knesset rather than within the context of parties trying to form a government, i.e. getting 61 MKs with a new leader of the Knesset simply saying, we won't have a prime minister who is under indictment in future. And that will gradually force Likud to get rid of Netanyahu.
Okay, let's have Richard answer that. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. It's very difficult to see what those levers are because you just see the sides so entrenched within themselves. But one possible solution is, ironically, you mentioned the New Hope Party, that the number 3 in New Hope Party is Ze'ev Elkin, who was previously one of Netanyahu's most loyal lieutenants. He actually served as coalition chairman from 2009 to 2013, with the incredible distinction, not only of that government lasting its full tenure, which is very rare, but the government didn't lose a single vote during that time period. And that was largely down to his acumen. And there was an incredible exchange between Yariv Levin, who was the Speaker of the House and kind of Elkin's former partner and shared lieutenant, that they had an exchange over this issue that I mentioned before about the election of the Arrangements Committee, because Elkin is kind of one of the smartest operators in the Knesset. He used to be at Netanyahu's service, and he's now playing for the other team, undermining and knows all the tricks that Likud have played before. And so it's going to be very interesting to see the Knesset tomorrow and to see whether his guile and tactical ability and knowledge of the bylaws of the Knesset are able to kind of to outfox his former teammates and be able to force the vote. And I think that is to an extent a bottleneck, that if the Group for Change are able to take control of key committees, they could also be in a position to challenge the Speaker of the House. We remember we saw that last March, and in what was considered a very poor move by, at the time, Benny Gantz, when he was he was going to stand himself as the chair, and he gave it away to the Likud. If the Bloc for Change are able to take over the proceedings of the House, even the Speaker or even the majority in some of these committees, then they have the potential of passing some very what Netanyahu would consider very, very nasty legislation, because they would make it impossible for a prime minister under indictment to then serve. And so there is a legislative way out of this if they have the tactical nous to be able to push that through, and if they then have the numbers to back it up. So I think that is a strong scenario. Otherwise, I think we're just going to have to wait it out. As I said, the sides are so entrenched and they don't seem any sign. A second aspect, which I'm just thinking of, which we'd actually discussed last week, is if in the scenario in 2 weeks' time, when Netanyahu can't form a government, then there is the potential for what we refer to as his natural allies, essentially the Haredi parties, for themselves to do a second think, and that they may not want to be kept out of the loop. And so it's not impossible that, especially under Naftali Bennett's leadership, who is a kind of a consensus figure of the centre right, he could persuade the Haredim to cross the Rubicon as well, and therefore you could have a government with them and alleviating the Likud, cutting them out of the process. So that's, I think it's not a strong candidate to play out feasibly, but it's not. I think the picture changes in 2 weeks' time when the mandate gets passed over from Netanyahu.
Thank you.
All of this stuff makes the game of chess sound like it's drafts. Mariel Quint has her hand raised. She'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, I don't look like Marielle.
Oh, sorry.
Richard, don't worry, it's Adam Quint here.
Oh, it's Adam. Hello, Adam.
Hello, Rabbi. Hi, Richard. I have a question for you, Rich, just about the demographics, right? And both short-term and long-term. I'm guessing, obviously, there's a short-term fix in politics right now in Israel, which is what we've been talking about. But how much do the politicians consider the long-term demographic trends in Israel and where things are heading in terms of the communities that are growing, which are obviously the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab communities greater than, let's say, the middle-class Israelis? And what's your view as to whether, even if politicians aren't considering that in their short-term deal-making, that might change the picture of the next election 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Because ultimately, that's the future of where Israel's heading, and I'm just curious as to your view.
Well, I think you're right in both of your assumptions. The one, sadly, Israeli politicians, it's all about short-termism. Even when we have a functioning government in Knesset, short-termism sadly rules. But you're absolutely right that the longer-term demographics in the favor of those that have bigger families, effectively, of being the ultra-Orthodox and even the settler community to a degree, and to an extent Muslim Arabs, and there's a distinction because the Christian birth rate is significantly lower. All of these things do essentially have a longer term impact. But it also reminds me that it's one of the issues, as I said, I think one of the most fundamental and significant issues of this last election, which we haven't mentioned yet, is the position and the legitimacy actually given by Netanyahu to the Israeli Arab parties being part of the political process, perhaps for the first time. Now that's been slightly, now that Netanyahu has the mandate, it's slightly off the agenda because there are the right wing or the extreme right wing of the Jewish parties refuse to sit with them. But the fact that Netanyahu has gone through such cooperation of all parties, the Islamist parties within the Knesset, has really set a precedent that has legitimized the engagement of Israeli Arabs. And by the way, this is one of the understandings that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir understand, that if they were to go in the short term into a government supported by the Arabs, then they know in the future, then that's legitimized for all time, and that suddenly the Arabs who would probably go for a more default position back to the Israeli left would have a certain numerical advantage. And as you say, kind of the long-term demographics being in their favor would very much be a knockout for the Israeli right, potentially, in the long term. So all of that calculation is there in the background as well.
Can we just come back to another area that we need to look at, and that is relations with the Biden government administration in America. It's all changed from the very warm relationship with President Trump and the enormous, incredible support that Israel had from him. One of the strange outcomes of this last administration was the relationship that Trump had with Israel. And now it's all changed. Can you talk us through the implications of that in terms of Israel, Iran, and of course funding from America, weapons, cooperation, and all the other stuff which happens behind the scenes when Israel and America are on the same footing?
Absolutely. I mean, you're right. This is as it always is with Israel, one of the most fundamental, significant relations in Israel's foreign policy. And as opposed to, let's say, the model of the Obama relationship, where Netanyahu decided it was politically convenient domestically to go head to head with the US administration because it played well domestically. On this time, at least so far, they've decided to play nicely and to work together. And to that end, there have been so far 2 meetings. And again, the most significant issue is the Iran issue by far. And so far, the sides have had 2 meetings, 2 work meetings on a level of national security advisor over secure telecommunication lines. They haven't been able to meet up in person yet. The first meeting was reported here, at least, and from sources that I've spoken to, they were pretty satisfied. It focused on the intelligence picture of which Israel and the US are reading the analysis in terms of the raw data in a very similar manner. That doesn't mean that their conclusions are going to be the same, but it was reassuring, at least from the Israeli perspective, that the US agree with the Israeli assessment. And the second meeting happened last week, which was broadly focused on Iran's regional issues and regional entrenchment in Syria, weapons to Hezbollah and to the Houthis, etc. The truth is that we don't have a readout yet of that meeting, so we don't know. But since then, and kind of just this morning, in the chatter within the Israeli security establishment has been now kind of a great deal of concern that it appears that the talks going on in Vienna are about to reach they're not yet reaching a conclusion, but the draft proposals that they're working on look to be able to bring back Iran to the nuclear deal. That's at least the assessment here, and there is grave concern about that. It's still that they're not throwing they're still kind of keeping things cordial and want to work with the Americans, but there is a great concern. I mean, the basic Israeli position says that if you let off the sanctions relief beforehand, then you lose any leverage that you have over Iran in being able to enforce them to do other things. And the way it seems here is that the Americans are prepared to drop the sanctions, and not just the nuclear sanctions, but there are other sanctions relating to their regional behavior, relating to their human rights abuses. And if they all go, then Israel would be very concerned that would mean that they've lost that leverage, and that the idea of, I mean, we saw last week the announcement, the day after the Natanz explosion, we saw the Iranians announcing that they're going to be increasing enrichment of uranium to 60%, which they've never done before. That's a very significant move. We shouldn't be, by the way, I mean, again, as I've had it explained to me by experts here, the 60% is a lot more than the number 60, because it's very, very close to weapons grade material. So we should be, and we are very, very concerned about that. And the idea that under this agreement, which is just in its draft form, that the Iranians would agree to unplug these centrifuges, but not dismantle them and not get rid of what they've already been able to enrich, also send warning signs for Israel. The third stage of the meetings and the dialogue that's going on between the national security councils is going to be ratcheted up. There is expected that the head of Mossad and the national security advisor will be traveling to America within the next 2 or 3 weeks, where they'll be able to have direct kind of meetings, four eyes meetings in person. And it's also thought that the head of Mossad will be taking more intelligence material that they haven't yet shared with the Americans to further push the case. So this is where it is. I mean, the Americans have also said to their credit, at least during the campaign, that they would consult with their regional partners. And so here, although the picture is looking less optimistic, the reassuring aspect is that Israel remains on the same page to the other Sunni states, the Gulf states that we discussed under the Abraham Accords, and Saudi Arabia as well, which, although they are not formally part of it, are very much in closed rooms part of that conversation as well. And they're all kind of very, the impression we have from here is that all of the Saudis and the other Gulfists are very supportive of Israel's positions. They're very appreciative of the strident acts that are attributed to Israel, both in terms of the naval warfare issues of stopping weapons and oil shipments, and the activities which are credited to Israel in the Natanz and other places. And so the strength of the regional relationship is good, and the relations with America are cordial at this stage, but there is a lot of concern with where Biden is going to go with this.
Thank you for that. Neil has his hand up. Neil, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks.
Can I just say before Neil asks his question, Neil is hugely helpful in terms of certainly the questions that I'm able to put to you are ones which Neil helps to formulate, etc. He's really a political wizzo, and so I always want to thank Neil for his tremendous support and participation. Really, he should be conducting this interview because he has a lot more to say than me. But let's hear his question.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks so much for your insight. Can we return to the Israeli presidential election in July and say, who's on maneuvers? Do the public care? And is it integrally wound up with someone cutting a deal of which coalition is put together for a government or not? Or can it be separated? And if the government hasn't been sorted, does President Rivlin get a extension?
Okay, so no, he definitely doesn't get an extension. The vote has to happen. The deadline for starting the campaign, it's in the hands of the procedure is in the hands of the Speaker of the House. He has since last week, up until for 3 months, up until the beginning of June, to declare the date for the election. It's an election which is just elected by the 120 members of the Knesset, and then there is, once the date is announced, there is a 3-week campaigning period. The chances are, your second last question, I think was probably the most important, because the chances are that if a government is formed within the coalition guidelines, the coalition will have agreed a candidate that they will back, and that will be the clear front runner. But who that is not clear at all at this stage. The name, probably the top name of people will be familiar with, who is a candidate or sees himself as a candidate, is Isaac Herzog, the former Labour leader, who is now the head of the Jewish Agency. And there are other candidates, but they're kind of peripheral candidates. But I don't see them really as serious yet. Ironically, there are 3 candidates, all historically from the Labour Party. Amir Peretz, the outgoing leader, also sees himself as a candidate, and a minister from the 90s, a law professor called Shimon Shitrit, is another name that has put himself into the mix. On the right, former Likud MK Yehuda Glick, who's kind of known first for kind of surviving an assassination attempt and hit for his activism on the Temple Mount, is also a candidate. But none of these seems to be a real consensus candidate. And although Isaac Herzog is probably the closest thing to it, the fact that he is traditionally obviously of the Labour Party, and the Labour Party with 7 seats doesn't really have enough political clout to necessarily push and back their own candidate. It's all wide open. Hanging in the background is some ideas from some Likudniks that Netanyahu, in an elegant move, can be moved on to the president's residence. But I don't think that's really serious, and I can't imagine that there will be enough people that will really go for this again. You need 10 signatures, 10 MK signatures to get on the ballot, and then it's a secret ballot. But my hunch would be, although we don't know the candidate, that if there is a government, it will be sewn up within the coalition agreement.
And the public care, don't care, interested, not bothered?
It's not really on the public radar yet. I imagine once we have real candidates that it will pick up a little bit more interest. I mean, I have to say that I mean, Rivlin for himself has been a pretty popular president. I mean, he made one big mistake, if you remember, last year, where along with other prominent politicians, when during Pesach lockdown 2020, he had invited family members to his Leil Seder, kind of breaking the rules and showing a bad dogma. But apart from that, he has played a very strong game. He is a true Democrat in the truest sense of the word. I think he gained a lot of the credibility just last week with the way he handled the consultation process, which was done under his insistence, under full transparency, where there were cameras in the room with all the coalition party leaders or the party representatives when they came in for the negotiations. And I can't think of a better word than disdain, his disgust even of having to give the mandate to a man who was under indictment, kind of really showed through with the symbolism that he didn't invite Netanyahu, as is traditionally done, to receive the mandate in person. He sent a courier to deliver the letter, and the next day he avoided the two photo ops, both pre and post Knesset swearing in, so he wouldn't be photographed with the Prime Minister. Says it all how he really feels, but at the same time, and in the speech he made, that it was clear that with the scores on the doors, with the numbers of endorsements, he had no choice than to give it to Netanyahu.
But had he been a sitting Knesset member when he was elevated to the presidency? Because the names that you're mentioning are all outside the Knesset at the moment. It feels like they're former party hacks. They're not currently part of the Knesset. So that's not part of people cutting a deal then.
Well, no, it's an interesting point. First of all, I would say just remember 7 years ago, Rivlin had very big boots to fill when he was replacing Shimon Peres, and people didn't really know if he would have the acumen and the ability to step into that role. But he's been, as I said, I think he's been very impressive. And kind of has left his lasting legacy in a few areas, but I think significantly in his framing of Israeli society as the four tribes that need to work together and need to build a future together, it kind of resonates on. But you're absolutely right. Historically, traditionally, because it is a Knesset electing itself, that often an MK finds himself in a better position to be elected. But as yet, none of the current MKs have put themselves forward, as far as I'm aware, to be a candidate for this. So either way, it looks like there will be an external candidate this time round.
So let's come to one other topic. Can you just fill us in, Richard, on what is happening with the International Criminal Court and the case which they're building against Israel? Many people will not be aware of this, or might be only peripherally aware of it. Can you give us some background, please, and where it's likely to be heading to?
Okay, so I mean, this is a process that also takes years. That they started to look into the opening of the investigation 5 years ago, and it's been moving on incrementally since then. We had the announcement just earlier this year that they were formally opening up an investigation, and from that date they were given a month, which just expired a couple of weeks ago, to decide what sort of how Israel as a government would relate to the charges, and the decision was made basically not to cooperate at all. They don't see, I mean, Israel has argued and will continue to argue that they don't see the court as having jurisdiction on this matter, for a couple of kind of broad legal reasons. One, they don't recognize Palestine as a state entity being able to have access and true standing in the court. There is also the issue of what's referred to as I'm forgetting the word, the complementary nature, that basically if a legal system is seen to have due process and have investigated itself, then the court also doesn't have jurisdiction. So based on those two broad legal arguments, Israel politely said to the court, we don't recognize your authority, and we're not going to be participating and sharing with any of that. It's now up to the prosecutors to build their case, and this can take again weeks and months. The outgoing prosecutor ends her term in the summer, and there's actually a British QC who is replacing her. I would say that after a few months of silence from the British government, which was met here with a degree of concern, because Israel is always kind of looking for the let's call them the moral minority of Western liberal countries that back Israel's stance, and Israel had good support from the US, both under Trump and under Biden. The Canadians, the Australians, the Germans, all had come in and given evidence to the court in Israel's favor that they also backed Israel's arguments. And just finally last week, Prime Minister Boris Johnson also sent a supportive letter, of which the British kind of came down on Israel's side as well, and saying that they also recognise that this court doesn't have jurisdiction. Whether that will have an impact is far less clear. The truth is, I don't know enough about the new personnel at the ICC itself, both the British judge that has come in and the British prosecutor as well. But they're going to have a very large bearing on this. But all of this, the wheels of justice and the ICC is kind of the most perhaps extreme version of this, move very, very slowly. They've only kind of prosecuted a few dozen cases in a 20-year period. So we don't expect any immediate movements on this, but the overall, I mean, even the fact that this has moved to prosecute is a mark of shame, and it's a mark of shame on the court, but it's also will make very difficult conversations going ahead in the future for Israel. And we can only speculate will be another question mark over when Israel does or doesn't act in certain scenarios. We'll have this court in the background as well.
Nevertheless, it sounds as if in the list of priorities of things that we should be worrying about and having sleepless nights about, this is a little bit lower down than some of the other issues that we've been discussing tonight.
I think it's important but not urgent, and I think there'll be times that it will cause us, I think, major headache in the future, but we're not there yet. Para, as they say.
Before we close tonight's session, anyone else wanted to raise any issues whatsoever relating to Israel, please do so now. You can either wave your hand or just speak up if you wish. Even if you've had a chance to speak before, you are allowed to speak again. There are no procedural rules that we are imposing tonight. All right. Well, Richard, once again, you have impressed us with your encyclopedic knowledge, just total, complete grasp. You are really absolutely inside these stories with complete and total mastery of it, and it's just an absolute pleasure to be able to hear you expound on them. It's hugely informative for us. We try to get our information from various sources. Sometimes it's confusing, you get bits and pieces, but to be able to have a session of this kind with this sort of briefing is enormously, enormously valuable. And I thank you once again for the time and the energy that you've put into this, and the tremendous conviction with which you speak. Obviously a man who loves your job and right in it. And to you, all of you who have joined us, thank you for participating in this session. It's as you know, with lockdown coming to an end, there are lots of other things that we can now do, like enjoy good weather and things like that. The fact that you've spent an hour with us to talk about this is really great, and thank you all for joining us. So Richard, Lindy, I think you wanted to say something.
I'd like to ask Richard what question he thinks we've omitted to ask.
What he had for supper.
I think we've covered most of it. The only other thing that people should be aware of as well is that there are Palestinian elections coming up in a few months. I mean, perhaps we can talk about that another time. But just again, it probably doesn't make the news internationally. But we had another incident of rocket fire over Shabbat from Gaza, and another one 2 nights before. And although, again, the latest security assessment was that it wasn't Hamas. Hamas doesn't have an interest to ignite another conflict now. It was more likely to be Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We should stay forever vigilant that that things are volatile in the Gaza Strip as well, and we've just seen another example of that.
Thank you.
Neil, was that with your hand up, or were you saying good
Yeah,
night?
just quickly as a thought. Does Israel have a view about the whole Jordan family rift, and who they'd rather, which brother or son-in-law they'd rather be there or not? Which one provides the stability and which one doesn't?
So there is. I've spoken to Israeli diplomats and security officials about this. The stock answer and the broad answer, which I think is genuine, is that Israel has a very supreme strategic interest in the stability of Jordan, and therefore at the moment will always back the king. The relationship the personal relationship between the king and Netanyahu is complicated and has gone through some difficult spells over the last couple of years, and in fact specifically over the last month or so. Again, I can expand on that if people are interested. But let me say, just in closing, a couple of the bottom line is that Israel will back the king, and I don't think the assessment here is that it wasn't really a coup. It was about kind of opposition, which even that is kind of unheard of within the Jordanian monarchy, which got the king's backup. But there were no serious military commanders involved and that were arrested. So the assessment is that it was far short of a coup. I would just say in closing that people are very welcome to check out BICOM's website. We have a wealth of analysis and information. And in fact, we did an interview just on our podcast last week with a prominent Palestinian journalist who lives in Jordan, who had some really fascinating analysis on the Jordanian situation and on the intrigue within the court there. So I encourage people to visit our website and listen to the podcast if that's of interest to people. And we produce regular analysis on an ongoing basis.
Well, with those closing words from our sponsor, we thank you once again, Richard, and I'm sure you'll be moving very quickly from this Zoom call to the BICOM website without a break in between. Enjoy. Thank you, Richard. Look forward to the
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you all.
Future briefings. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.